what is it that makes an ethical standard set by or from God objective, whereas an ethical standard set by or from an individual human is relative?
Great question. Thanks for raising it, sir. If this woman's value is based on her culture, if she moves from this culture to a different culture that says, no, you're a woman, you're inferior, then her value changes. Because value is simply based on cultural bias. But if in reality she has been created by God for a purpose, to love and worship Him and to love and serve others, then regardless of which culture she's in, regardless of what her culture tells her, she has an innate value because she's not an accidental piece of scum evolved to a higher order. She's a human being created in the image and the likeness of God, which means her value is not based on culture, it's based on an intrinsic worth that comes from her Creator.
Aren't you making an artificial conflation between utilitarian value and ethical value and saying that having a purpose gives you value?
You're right. I am saying that if she is an accidental collection of atoms, for her to argue that she has innate worth is an exercise in la-la land. It's a fantasy. It's an illusion. It's a personal taste. Like, do you like broccoli or do you like asparagus? Well, Cliff, I like broccoli. All right, that's her taste. It doesn't mean that broccoli is better than asparagus. It's a taste she has. So, do you think you're worth anything? Yes, I think I'm the greatest. Okay, well, that's a taste. No, I think I'm a loser, because I'm not a whatever. That's a taste. So my point is, if in reality she's simply a hunk of primordial slime evolved to a higher order, to argue that she has innate, objective worth is egotism. It's just a flight into fantasy land. Because in reality, she's no different from this. This is matter and energy, and she's matter and energy, and the interesting question then becomes, why do I step on this and not on her? Does that make any sense?
Yes, it does, but perhaps I'm just slow today, but I still don't see that you've answered the question. What you seem to be saying is that God is capable of having tastes that, by way of being tastes held by God, are objectively binding rather than merely relative. And I don't see where this comes from.
Okay, great question. If God has a character that is just, if God is a thinking being who can create a value of justice, then that value is real, it's objective. If there is no creator who can create the value of justice, then obviously you and I create the value of justice. But that's just a result of our minds concluding this is just, this is unjust. There's no real value of justice, we just create it in our heads.
Well, first, if you have created a value of justice in your head, that justice is real in as far as you have successfully created it. But more to the point, why is it that the justice created by God is real if He did have to create it, whereas justice created by us is not real?
Because what is justice based on? It's based on the dignity of this person. What's unjust? Injustice, or being unjust, is me devaluing this human being who has an innate value. So, if she has no value, I can steal her backpack, I can stamp on her, because she's trash. But if she has innate value, then for me to steal her backpack, or for me to step on her, is a denial of her innate worth.
And that innate worth can somehow be conferred by God, where it is not conferable by mere human beings.
Precisely. Because God is eternal, He's the one who created her for a purpose, so she's more than a cosmic accident. She's a creation of God created for a purpose and that's why she has value.
But why does the act of intentional creation confer purpose? Humans are also capable of acts of intentional creation. We have intentionally created life forms, in fact. We've cloned sheep, we have built protocells, and those things have purpose in as far as we intended them to exist and existed to fulfill some utility for us. Do those things have an innate value by fact of having been intentionally created that other organisms, say a sheep that was not cloned or a protocell that arose according simply to the laws of determinism, do not have?
Our gifts of creativity are awfully exciting. And yet, as the scriptures would insist, our gifts of creativity reflect the Creator. And although we can be creative, we are not eternal beings who are all-powerful the way God is. Our creativity is a small reflection of the creativity of God. So yes, we can attach value to people, animals, objects. We can sell one object for $1 million and another object for 50 cents. So we obviously can attach value. But to attach value in an objective way to a human life, in light of the fact that we're all human, and if there is no God, we're all the result of chance and fate, chance mutations, natural selection, well, I mean, that's a nice bias, but it's just a bias. It's just a taste. It's arbitrary. It's not real in the sense that if you contradict it, you're wrong. If I contradict it, I'm wrong.
How is the attribution of value from God any less arbitrary than that, though? You've raised the point multiple times that God, if he exists, is eternal, as if the argument somehow hinges upon this, as if a subjective standard that exists in perpetuity is indistinguishable from an objective standard, and I don't see that this is obvious.
Okay. In order to have value, in order to have worth, in order to have a value of justice or compassion, you have to have a thinking mind. Inanimate matter has no ability to grasp justice, compassion, the worth of a human being. It takes a mind to understand those intangible, non-physical concepts. If there is no mind prior to the human mind, then it's obviously the human mind that has created right, wrong, worth, lack of worth in our heads, which means it's simply a construct that we've put together. It has a beginning. It's not absolute in any sense. It's something we've created with our thinking. But if there is an eternal being who created reality, and not only did he create matter and energy, but he also created values of love, compassion, worth, and justice, then it's possible that those intangible, unseen values are real and not just the figment of the human imagination or the human mind.
Perhaps there's some sort of problem of communication. I feel like you've already had to make that point, and maybe I'm a little dense for not getting it after the second time. But God, having created reality and then proceeded to create values of justice, of truth and beauty and so forth, that act of creation on his part does not seem distinct from such an act of creation on the part of an individual human being. Although his consciousness, if he did exist by nature of being eternal, would precede ours, there is no obvious standard by which we might judge the values that he creates to be superior to the values that we create. Is it simply the fact that he came before us? Does he have primacy by nature of having been here first? Or is it superiority by way of having been responsible for our creation, such that we are supposed to defer to him merely because he is our creator, as if there is some value in that?
It has to do with the fact that he is God and I am not, which means he is eternal, I am not. He's all-powerful, I am not. He is perfectly just and holy, I am not. I'm a mixture of good and evil. He is not a mixture of good and evil. He has the ability to create on a far more massive scale, a far more deeper way than I do. For instance, God created something out of nothing. You and I can't do that. You and I cannot create something out of nothing. God can. So that's an example of how God is a being of a totally different order than you and I are.
Now, you say that the reason God's standards are binding is that he is perfectly just and holy by nature of being of a different order of being than we are. But were we not just discussing that God created the standards of justice and holiness? It doesn't seem that it's a terribly convincing argument that his will is the will to defer to in these matters because he is perfectly just, when the standard of justice is a standard that he himself set.
I've miscommunicated. You listen well. I thank you for taking me so seriously that you listen so well. God, I misspoke. God did not create justice. God's character has been just throughout eternity. So justice is something that flows from the eternal character of God. So God didn't, in other words, wake up one morning and say, I think I'm going to create a new value called justice. No. God is eternal. He has a character. His character is eternal. And justice is defined and is a value that has existed throughout eternity because it's what God's character is. So thanks for pushing for that clarification.
So, are you saying that there is an eternal character of justice to which God's character coincidentally conforms?
No. God's character is just, so it is God's character that defines justice. It is not justice that defines God's character.
So, God's character, by its nature, is the embodiment of justice. And this is the grounds on which his concept of justice is binding upon all other things. Is that what you're saying? By what criterion have you adjudged God's character to be the perfect embodiment of justice?
Obviously, only because God has chosen to reveal that by speaking through the Hebrew prophets. Secondly, by becoming a man in Jesus. He has revealed what is just. Secondly, as I look at the life of Christ that he lived out, in my best moments, I wish I could live that kind of life. I try to live that kind of life. I miserably fail, to be honest with you. I miserably fail in trying to live a life like Christ did. So, when I use my rational mind and my conscience and examine Jesus Christ, the way he lived, and then what he revealed about what is true, like by reading the Sermon on the Mount, my conscience and my rational mind say, wow, although I have not been successful in living up to that high standard, I certainly respect it. For instance, Robert Coles, a psychology professor at Harvard, wrote, all the writings on ethics over the past 2,000 years are simply footnotes to the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, is ethical brilliance. So, God has revealed what justice is. Through our consciences, we can begin to grapple with the value of justice. And then secondly, he's given us a very clear plumb line to measure our consciences against, and that plumb line is the Hebrew prophets and Jesus of Nazareth.
Isn't the intuition that we ought to be measuring our consciences against those works of God that you consider to be just indicative of the existence of a standard of justice internal to yourself and separate from that espoused by God? You are, in other words, judging these acts of God according to a standard that you hold, and judging God just based upon his conformity to your standard.
Yes.
So how is that different from case 3, in which justice is determined individually by humans, wherein you have now determined as an individual that God is the epitome of justice?
As a thinking human being, I have to grapple with the pursuit of truth. And Jesus made some truth claims. The Hebrew prophets made some truth claims. And so I, as a thinking, rational human being, have to look at those truth claims and ask myself, does the evidence point to those being reliable, credible, or does the evidence point to those being ridiculous, off the wall? Now, I have a lot of friends who used to be atheists, and now they are following Christ. And one of them went to Harvard, and now he is a member of the church that I pastor. And he was real blunt with me and real honest with me. He said, when I went to Harvard, I wanted to live a certain lifestyle that was pretty promiscuous. I sort of in the back of my head thought that God existed. So when I lived this promiscuous lifestyle, I experienced guilt. But I figured out that the way to deal with my guilt was to wipe God out of the picture, because that would free me to live a morally relative life, to embrace that life philosophy, which then would free me to live a totally promiscuous life without any guilt. And he tells me it worked. But then he met this woman, who he's married to now, who had a relationship with Christ, and she began to challenge him, to love him, to be patient with him, but to challenge him to think more deeply about why did you buy into atheism? And he eventually broke and was very honest and said, I bought into atheism not because of some profound intellectual process, but I became an atheist because I needed to be able to justify my promiscuous lifestyle without having to carry around the baggage of guilt that I had done something wrong. Well, I appreciate that kind of honesty tremendously.
So, when this man converted from atheism to Christianity, was this not simply indicative of his personal, internal, and relative standard of morality being revised by the actions of things in his environment, in this case, his wife, on his own consciousness?
No. I think the evidence is that every human being, be we atheist, agnostic, Hindu, Buddhist, Jew, Muslim, Christian, we all have conscience. Like it or not, you have a conscience. I have a conscience. The fascinating thing as I study conscience is, I don't automatically change my conscience, I argue with my conscience. Now, in my arguing with my conscience, I can get to the point where I sear my conscience so many times that my conscience gets quieter and quieter. I have done that. I have done what I thought was wrong so many times that I began to rationalize and be able to justify doing what was wrong. But if I will allow my conscience to speak to me, it will make me aware of the fact that indeed there are objective morals. And when I violate those objective morals, I experience guilt.
Through what mechanism is it that an unseared conscience is capable of ascertaining objective morality?
All you have to do is watch a child get abused. Then you ask yourself, is it objectively wrong to abuse a child? And because that's such a clear issue, I think the answer is abundantly clear to every one of us here. The abuse of an innocent child is absolutely wrong. Now, the intelligent professor, though, says, wait a second. It's not that clear cut. What happens if you've gone down in a boat at sea? There are 6 of you swimming in the water. There's one life raft that only fits 5. The 6th will make the life raft sink. So if you're one of 6 swimming around in the ocean with a life raft that only has room for 5, what are you going to do? And the point of the professor is, you see, morality is relative. But here's where I disagree with the professor. The only reason that that is an ethical dilemma, gosh, what do we do, guys? There's only 5 seats and there's 6 of us, is because we understand the value of human life. If we didn't understand the value of human life, there would be no ethical dilemma. I blow you away and I take the seat. It's not wrong for me to blow you away or dunk you under and hold you under until you drown. You see, the only reason you've got an ethical dilemma there is because you treasure human life. If you didn't treasure human life, there'd be no ethical dilemma.
We don't need to get into strange utilitarian edge cases to see the problem with this, though. We can get back to the original question of abusing an innocent child. It's not obvious that this is objectively incorrect. Before the audience or anyone else feels the need to jump down my throat for saying this, I personally feel that we should not abuse innocent children, but I'm under no illusion that this is anything other than a personal preference for a personally held taste that does not in any way necessarily correspond to an objective morality outside of my personal structure of preferences and tastes. Now, when you were speaking of consciences earlier, particularly the unseared conscience that you have not repeatedly abused by doing things that it has told you already are incorrect, you spoke as if that conscience somehow transcended structures of personal preference and taste and was in contact with an objective morality. And I am still curious as to exactly how that is supposed to function.
The way your conscience functions, I hope, is that although you can tell me intellectually that you realize that the abuse of an innocent child is not objectively wrong, I don't think you can live that out. I think that 100 times out of 100, 1,000 times out of 1,000, when you are confronted by the abuse of an innocent child, you never say, well, this is possibly okay.
I certainly hope that would be the case as well. I like to think of myself as the sort of person who would not stand by and watch an innocent child be abused. But we're failing to distinguish here between the way in which a subjective standard of morality is binding upon the person who holds it subjectively, and the way that an objective standard of morality would be binding upon every person. The fact that my ethical tastes and preferences are particular to me and only me gives them no lesser power of compulsion over me, under the assumption that this is the way that ethical tastes and preferences function, of course, then an objective standard would be binding upon me and you and everyone else here listening to this talk. In what manner, then, are these things to be distinguished from each other?
All right. Please stop eating that wrap. Why? Because wraps with lettuce and turkey?
It's chicken.
Chicken? That's not tasty. What's much more tasty is roast beef in there with tomatoes. Okay, that's taste. And I think I'm an arrogant twit if I try and convince her that eating that wrap is wrong, because it's a matter of taste. But if she is abusing an innocent child, I'm going to look her in the face and say, when you abuse this innocent child, that is absolutely wrong. And there is a qualitative difference between the two.
Is there?
Absolutely yes. There's a qualitative difference between, I don't like the taste of chicken with green wrap. You should have whole wheat bread and roast beef, versus, please do not abuse an innocent child, for that is evil. Qualitative difference between the two. No, I cannot put justice in the bottom of a test tube. But you see, that's why I'm different from my atheist friends. Because my atheist friends have limited reality to matter and energy, which means you better be able to put it in the bottom of this test tube. Otherwise, it's probably not real. And I'm standing here saying, please examine your life and realize that all of reality cannot be put in the bottom of a test tube. There is a value of justice that you cannot scientifically verify, but instead you need to use your conscience and your observation of life to understand that that value of justice is objective.
Thank you very much for giving me your time.
Thank you so much for the waiting. The 2005 Oscar-winning movie, Crash, is a fascinating study of racism, good and evil, instinct and conscience. Matt Dillon plays a white, racist police officer. One night, while giving a sobriety test to an African-American gentleman, the wife slips out of the other side of the car, and the white racist police officer begins to sexually abuse her. The next day, this white racist police officer arrives on a crash scene. A person is pinned underneath a car that is turned over. Gas is everywhere, and fire is coming in their direction. But Matt Dillon climbs under the car. Unfortunately, he faces the person who's trapped. And to his shock, he finds out it's the woman he sexually abused the night before. She screams, "Get out of here, get out of here." But instead of getting out of there, Matt Dillon risks his life to save her. He realizes if she lives, she could press for prosecution of him, take him to court, get him nailed. He also realizes that the flames are getting closer and closer to the gas that is dripped out from the car. And his police officer friends are warning him, watch out, get out of there. But instead of getting out of there alone, he frees the woman and pulls her out. Every instinct in his body was telling him, get out. She's going to prosecute you, and you might get blown to bits if the fire hits the gas. But he fights against the instinct to preserve his life. He puts himself in real danger and saves the life of this woman. That is a tremendous example of conscience trumping instinct. Why does conscience at times trump instinct. Because you and I have been created in the likeness of a God who is just. You and I have this innate understanding of right versus wrong, justice versus injustice, good versus evil. That's one of the reasons we enjoy watching movies, where good and evil are pitted against each other so clearly. You and I have violated our consciences. That's why you've experienced guilt. That's why I've experienced guilt. A very good motivator in life is conscience. Allow your conscience to motivate you to ask for forgiveness when you've done wrong. Allow your conscience to motivate you not to repeat that wrong, but to do what's right. But most importantly, allow the God who gave you a conscience to forgive you, to wipe away the guilt. And secondly, allow the God who gave you that conscience to live within you, to change you from the inside out, so that the fight you conduct with your conscience, you'll win more often. That's what a Christian is, in one sense. A Christian is someone who's asked Christ to live within them, and they're allowing God's Holy Spirit to help them win the battle that the conscience in you and in me fights against temptation, against the lure of lust, greed, jealousy, hatred, revenge. Jesus Christ bled and died on a cross for a very good reason. Because down in the depths of your conscience and in the depths of my conscience, you and I know that at times we have done wrong. We deserve punishment, for we have rebelled against God. Jesus bled and died on the cross to pay the penalty, to take the punishment that we deserve in His body, so that you and I might be forgiven by God and might be reconciled to God and might receive the gift of eternal life with Christ in heaven. How is it with you? Have you allowed your guilt to motivate you to turn to Christ for forgiveness? Or are you simply trying to rationalize away the wrong that you've chosen to do? Choose Christ. Ask Him for forgiveness. He promises to forgive. Trust in Him that He died on the cross for you and receive the gift, the incredible gift of eternal life that He promises to all who trust in Him. God bless you as you make that most important decision to trust in Jesus Christ. I'm the pastor of Grace Community Church. We meet every Sunday morning, 9:30 at Sachs Middle School in New Canaan, Connecticut. Take the Merritt Parkway to exit 37, go to the end of the ramp, take a left onto Route 124, go approximately 1 mile and take a right into Sachs Middle School. I'd love to greet you and welcome you personally to our worship service, 9:30 this Sunday morning. Thanks for joining us for these few minutes. Have a great day.